Usually you will find things we talk about in one show become relevant a few days later, a few weeks later, even a few months later. A lot of times, this show is going to seem like Babe Ruth calling the shot and then hitting it. It ain't magic, though. It's just following the implications of the news. When you break down the language people are using in their coverage, and you sort out what is wishy-washy language, and you sort out what they are really saying, it's not hard to make the connection to a story that is developing down the line. We have that happen frequently. I'm going to try to point it out and provide links to previous episodes where I can, and you'll see a whole new level of context for the events of the day. But let's get right to it. Right now, as we speak, is Brazil's Jan 6th. They had a far right-wing authoritarian wannabe dictator in the form of Jair Bolsonaro. My God, Bolsonaro. In fact, the parallels are wild. Their far right authoritarian also went to Florida in the U.S. after getting booted out of office. He also questioned the legitimacy of the election without reason, without cause, other than to keep himself in office. Here is what that resulted in.
Eu sou repórter experiente na cobertura de conflitos, é horror isso daí. Nunca tivemos.
Now, obviously, that's in Portuguese. But here's the scene, folks. This is the aftermath of their version of J6. I don't know how long ago. When it'd be January 1st. So when Bolsonaro was booted out, Lula took his place. Lula is significantly farther left than Joe Biden. I wouldn't exactly call him as left as the right will say he is, as frankly no one is. But he's closer to a Bernie Sanders than a Joe Biden, if you're looking for an equivalency. When he got out of office the first time, the far right in his country tossed him in prison. A legal battle ensued. He got out. Then he got elected. He was sworn in on January 1st, so here's our first difference from the, you can see the aftermath here. You can see how the rioters trashed the centers of power in Brazil. But when when Lula got elected, Bolsonaro did the usual, what is becoming the usual right-winger playbook. Said it was a fake election, yada yada, fraud, blah 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 blah. Well, the scene looked almost identical to what happened in the USA. We had a commenter. We had a commenter the other day say we don't want America to become like Brazil. It's more accurate, I would say, with respect, to say that Brazil is becoming more like America in all the worst ways. We have a lot of similarities to Brazil currently. In fact, I would say Brazil, in terms of how its politics works, is like America's twin brother that sometimes gets mistaken for it. A lot of similarities. The main difference you have is simply the size of the country and the speed at which things move, because it is a smaller country. So, here's what happened today. And I'm sure we're going to find out that Russia had a hand in this, and probably forces in the U.S. had a hand in this. But a bunch of people, see if you can count the similarities, a bunch of people believing a lie that a far right-wing politician told about the election, showed up at the seats of power in Brazil. There's three buildings. I'm sorry, I don't know their names, and I don't want to pooch it. But three buildings with where the government is centered in Brazil had a giant protest, which ended up turning into a riot. They stormed in, they messed the places up, as you're seeing here on CNN Brazil's coverage of this. I believe I've put the link to that in the description. If you speak Portuguese, you'll get some benefit from that. If not, at the very least, look at that. You can see how alike this looks. I think if you're hearing that popping, I think that's the sound of the cameraman walking on glass, or whoever's got the phone there, walking on the broken glass. That's not unlike, what you're seeing there is not unlike what our Capitol building looked like. So they were draped, a lot of these folks were wearing what would be in Brazil patriotic colors, the colors of their flag. And the police response to it was weak, because these were right-wingers gathering. When left-wingers gather, the police response is brutal. They are ready to crack heads right away. Right-wingers gather, well, police say let them do what they're going to do. Here's where it differs. Number one, Brazil already got to see this happen once when it happened in the U.S. Number two, Lula is he was an organizer of workers' movements to start his career, at least in politics. He's a socialist. He's farther left-wing, which means he's more of a realist. He had an actually strong response. The largest news network in Brazil right away called this a terrorist attack. Right away. While it was happening, the largest news network in Brazil called this a terrorist attack. It took our major networks. Let's set Fox aside. We know that's simply propaganda for right-wing extremists. Our networks, MSNBC, CNN, ABC, etc., they took months to start calling this the January 6th, the terrorist attack. They took a very long time. I was working in corporate media, and I remember the debates we had over this, and it aged me to have to say, what is terrorism? Terrorism is the threat of violence to achieve a political means. This is definitionally terrorism. Why are we still talking about this? It made me crazy. But there's such hesitation in this industry, in America, frankly, around the world, but specifically in America, to call anyone associated with the right wing anything bad ever, and to cover for them by default, to downplay their villainy by default. It's not to say there's no villainy amongst Democrats. There certainly is. But it's called what it is straight away, or worse, when it's a lefty doing it. This is normally when I'd say let's listen to the person, but I'm presuming most of you don't speak Portuguese. Okay. Ministro da Justiça. I can assume that we are now hearing from the official in charge of justice. Oh, let me just...
Muito grave.
Yeah, so I won't get anything out of this. I do apologize. But I wanted to show you that so that you could see a bit of the aftermath. But don't worry, we also have an article about this that I'd like to look at. Because look, I'm saying it matches America's January 6th riot so much. And okay, in a lot of the political ways it does, but it's not like It's not like they had, the QAnon shaman there running around. Okay, well, turns out that is exactly what they had. That's from an earlier protest against Lula, inspired by Bolsonaro. The parallels are wild. I left a link in the description for when we saw Bolsonaro's swearing-in ceremony. I gave a little background on Lula's swearing-in ceremony. I gave a little background on who he is, and at the time, I said, "This is a great a great country to look at for examining what America is up to, what American politics looks like. If you want to know what it looks like from afar, a great way to see that is looking at Brazil. There are indeed a ton of similarities, including the consequences of an action. Fortunately, let me tell you this: Lula has, and I'm hearing like a grinding. I'm not sure what that is. Hopefully, it doesn't appear on the stream, and I apologize if it does. Lula immediately said, "Everyone who participated will be held accountable, including the police who failed to act." In other words, Lula's not putting up with this nonsense. And we in the U.S. should take a page out of that book. I have great news on that front in the coming segments. But first, let's have a look at what happened. This is a story from the AP. Y'all hear that? Oh, well. Supporters of former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, good God, who refused to accept his election defeat, stormed Congress, the Supreme Court, and presidential palace in the capital on Sunday, a week after the inauguration of his leftist rival, President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, or Lula for short. It's like a nickname he has. Thousands of demonstrators bypassed security barricades. Doesn't that sound familiar? Climbed on roofs. Doesn't that sound familiar? Broke windows and invaded all three buildings. Doesn't that sound familiar? Which are connected by the vast Three Powers Square in Brasilia. Some called for a military intervention to either restore the far-right Bolsonaro to power or oust Lula from the presidency. Sort of the same thing, but fair enough. About 5:30 p.m. local time, less than 3 hours after the storming. Remember, it took us longer to get this under control. The U.S., who pours money into law enforcement, who pours money into the military, took us longer to get ours under control. To be fair, this was after Lula was sworn into office, which means Lula was the ultimate controller of these things. It tells you a bit about Trump's intentions. Why did it take so long for us to get a response? Indeed, we ought to talk about that in a court of law. The incidents recalled the January 6, 2021 assault on the U.S. Capitol by supporters of then-President Donald Trump. Political analysts have warned for months that a similar storming was a possibility in Brazil, given that Bolsonaro has sown doubt about the reliability of the nation's electronic voting system without any evidence. Boy, does that not sound familiar. The results were recognized as legitimate by politicians from across the spectrum, as well as dozens of foreign governments. So, folks, there ain't a lot of mystery here. We've seen this before. We know what this is. This is a coup. It's an attempt at a coup. if it's clear there, it ought to be clear here. Let's see how long it takes the Brazilian government to actually file charges against Jair Bolsonaro. Let's see how long it takes the Brazilian government to get this done. I have a feeling they may have filed charges before we do. Think about how embarrassing that will be. They may have the situation develop, deal with it, and then handle it in the courts before we even file charges against Donald Trump. Be on the lookout. Watch Brazil if you want to know what America looks like and what America can look like. The farther left you go, the more effective governance you get. Lula is left of Biden. We are likely to see an actual satisfactory response to this.